Visits the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York, and explores the career of our 32nd president.
A library built by popular subscription to house the archives, papers, and mementos of the Franklin D. Roosevelt era is dedicated to the nation by the President himself.
And this latest addition to the archives of America is dedicated at a moment when government of the people by themselves is being attacked everywhere. It is therefore proof, if any proof is needed, that our confidence in the future of democracy has not diminished in this nation and will not diminish.
Costing about $250,000, the Dutch colonial building, erected on land donated by the President, is really a Roosevelt museum, filled with the historical material of Roosevelt's public life, as well as many of his cherished keepsakes. His ship models, a rare collection. Most interesting are the many curios sent to him from admirers the world over. A new shrine for America.
And this is the Roosevelt Library Museum as it is today, more than 66 years after Franklin Roosevelt dedicated this first-of-its-kind resource. Tonight, as we continue our Presidential Library series, we will look at some of the holdings of the FDR Library as we explore the leadership and communication style of the president who led the United States through the Great Depression and World War II. Joining us inside the library from what was once President Roosevelt's personal study is the director of the library, Dr. Cynthia Cook. Thank you very much to you and your team for hosting us tonight.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure, Susan. We are delighted to have you and all of the viewers here in Hyde Park at the Roosevelt Presidential Library. And before we even begin, I want to thank you and the wonderful C-SPAN team, which has been working with us so dutifully and so busily these past few weeks, and I'm really grateful for all of the work that they've put into this evening.
Why don't you tell us a little bit more about the FDR Library and what it's like today?
Well, I'd like to, if I could, set a historical context and then maybe come up to the present, if you excuse me, if you don't mind. As you saw in the clip that was just played, we had discussion of democracy, if it's going to survive. And this library was dedicated in June of 1941, 6 months before our country got into World War I with World War II with the attack on Pearl Harbor. The war in Europe had been going on since September of 1939, and a year earlier, with the fall of France, the entire European continent was under the domination of the Nazis. Of course, the Holocaust, their insistence on a master race, all of those horrible deeds come to mind immediately to us today. But I think in seeing this library, we should also remember that they stood for a determination to block freedom of expression, one of the 4 freedoms of Roosevelt. And the way they expressed that in Germany, of course, was with book burnings and with the destruction of so-called degenerate art. So when Roosevelt dedicated this library, he was saying that he believed the dedication of a library expressed a faith in democracy and a faith in the ability of people to govern themselves by freedom and expression and creating their own books and creating their own research. And so today we have a library that is very much exactly as Roosevelt envisioned it. It holds 17 million pages of documents, photographs, audiovisual collections. Some of those are President Roosevelt's himself, about 8 million of them. They date from his life as a state senator here in New York, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Woodrow Wilson, as a 2-term governor of New York, and ultimately 4-term president. Mrs. Roosevelt's papers are also here, as are the papers of 385 of their colleagues and associates, because that's what Roosevelt envisioned. He wanted it to be a place that was a time capsule, and it had all of the papers of the era in which he and Mrs. Roosevelt were the leaders of our country. And we think he was very successful in that. But as you saw in the clip, he was also envisioning a museum, a place to hold his personal collections. And those personal collections to him were important because they were educational. He thought people would learn something by seeing his ship models, his prints of Navy history, his historical prints. And so he brought all of that together here in Hyde Park and made it a gift to the American people.
Talk to us a little bit about his planning for the library.
Well, he started planning for the library in his second term when he, like all presidents before him and actually since, have decided to retire from office. For Roosevelt, retirement was going to be a time of writing his memoirs, writing articles, writing books, sorting through his historical collections and organizing things. So he began searching for an institution that would take his collections. He wanted them all to stay in one place to provide that kind of microcosm of the era. And he could find no place. And so finally, by 1938, he began to think of this new kind of institution, which we know today as a presidential library. It would be both an archive and a museum, and of course, in its modern incarnation, it is also a community center and an education center where we have active education programs for 15,000 students from second grade right up through college, as well as public programs for the general public. So it's a very vital institution, and I think Roosevelt would be very pleased at what he started.
I think you even have one of his early sketches from 1938. Is that right?
I do, and it's right here on this stand. And you can see, if you come in close, that it is a U-shaped building, very much like what we have today. And within the building, he actually made decisions about where the presidential papers would be, PP, N for Naval Collections, HR for Hudson River Valley, and the director's office is still right where he wanted it to be. And in between, we have some room for the ship models. So it's a fascinating story of how this building, which was sketched on a piece of paper, April 12, 1937, ended up becoming the Roosevelt Library that we know today. He worked closely with the architect in laying out all of the interiors as well as the exterior, which was designed in the Dutch colonial style. That was his favorite architectural style. He used it for the library, for other buildings that he designed, Top Cottage and Eleanor Roosevelt's cottage at Valkill, as well as schools and post offices whose construction and design he influenced here in the Hudson Valley. He thought Dutch colonial building, in fact all colonial building, was a good style because it helped people remember our colonial and revolutionary history and the great hardships that our people have overcome in the past, a lesson of, obviously, for the Great Depression and what people were facing in the 1930s.
Now that room that you're in is actually his personal study. Can you tell us a little bit more about it? Certainly,
certainly. This room, he intended to spend his time writing his memoirs, sorting his collections. It's furnished and sits here very much the way it was when he last was here at the end of March 1945. Because of the turn of events, of course, that he decided in 1941 that he would run for, in 1940, that he would run for a third term and was ultimately elected. With the war breaking out in Europe, by the time this building was completed, the library became part of an extension of his presidency. So the room that we are in tonight actually became a transplantation of his study in the White House. And from this room, 4 major addresses to the American people were delivered. 2 of them were fireside chats. One of them you're going to listen to later in this broadcast. But he also made 220 visits up here to sort through his papers. And one of his most pleasurable things was bringing his dignitary guests, the heads of state, here to show off his personal library. And he would bring them here into the study and have them sign this guest book, which we are opening to one of the very earliest pages, where we can see the signature of Winston S. Churchill, Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands, Clementine Churchill, and Madam Chiang Kai-shek here at the top. And that book continues to this day. We're very proud of it. It's a wonderful document of of the kinds of people that have visited this historic library. But most of all, it's important to remember that this was a working office. And when he came here, he would stretch out. We have his cousin, Daisy Sukley, was one of the archivists who worked here. Of course, this was part of the National Archives beginning in 1941. And the president would come up here on weekends, stretch out on the floor, or sit in this beautiful blue chair and start sorting through his papers, just like an archivist, or sorting through his artifacts, just like a curator. And that's why I'm so delighted that tonight you're going to hear from today's head archivist, Robert Clark, and our head curator, Herman Eberhardt. And that's what this program is really all about. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Cynthia Cook, and we will be spending more time with Dr. Cook at the end of our program when we also have time for your telephone calls. Joining me in our set in Washington, D.C. is Richard Norton Smith, presidential historian, who has been our consulting historian for this entire series and will be on the set with us throughout our 12 weeks. And as we get started here, we wanted you to just do the very top-line facts for people that don't know very much about FDR.
You bet. Bare bones. Franklin Roosevelt was born January 30th, 1882 in Hyde Park, New York, son of a Hudson River Valley squire. Graduated from Harvard University in 1903. On St. Patrick's Day, 1905, he married his distant cousin Eleanor. After a stint in the New York State Senate, he was appointed by Woodrow Wilson Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913, the same job his cousin Theodore had once held. In 1920, he was the Democratic vice presidential candidate, along with Governor James Cox of Ohio. The following year, need to say they didn't win, but the following year he contracted polio, which transformed his life, needless to say. He beat the odds in his disability in 1928 to win the first of 2 terms as governor of New York. In 1932, defeated Herbert Hoover, the first of 4 terms as president of the United States. He died in Warm Springs, Georgia, on the 12th of April, 1945.
Okay, those are really almost painfully basic of someone who served unprecedented 4 terms as president of the United States. What are the man and beyond the myth that people ought to know about?
Well, first of all, he's the president against whom all others are measured since. That's because of the events that he had to deal with and how he dealt with them. His presidency is bookended by arguably the 2 greatest crises of the 20th century, the Great Depression and World War II. It was said, in fact, in the 1930s that it took a man on crutches to teach a crippled nation how to walk. And he redefined the presidency in ways that are still being felt today. He made it an office of moral advocacy, and his personality. Winston Churchill said that meeting Franklin Roosevelt for the first time was like uncorking your first bottle of champagne. There was a great ebullience, a joie de vivre, which communicated itself to a desperate nation. But there was also steel in his soul. And that, no doubt, was, at least in part, the result of what he had gone through in the 1920s fighting polio.
We are going to be, throughout this entire series, showing people at home rare video and listening to rare audio with the help of the archivists at these various libraries. They'll be able to see, to get a real measure of the presidents themselves. Tonight, our focus is going to be on 2 parts of the collection. That will be on fireside chats. That's something people have probably heard about. And then also some secretly recorded conversations and press conferences from the Oval Office during FDR's term. Now, first of all, fireside chats.
Right. Well, FDR is the first great communicator. You know, he once said, "I want to be a preacher president, like my cousin Teddy." And by the 1930s, the bully pulpit was electronic. He had radio at his command. And in fact, he, as we will see, he also had the movies. And he did not hesitate to exploit both in an effort to communicate his message and rally the American people at a time, as I say, when their spirits were very low.
Well, our first fireside chat is from 1933, just after FDR comes into office. They weren't even really known as fireside chats then. And it has to deal with the bank crisis. Give us a little of what we need to know about the crisis he was dealing with.
The great metaphor, the end of the Hoover administration, one of the real contributing factors to the Depression was the banking system, which was rickety to begin with, unregulated. You had there were too many banks. They were speculating with deposits in the stock market, and the whole banking system began to collapse over the winter of 1932-33. It was above all a crisis of confidence, and that's the first test that met the new president really the moment he took office.
Here is Franklin Delano Roosevelt speaking to the nation just 8 days after he first took office. Let's listen in.
I want to tell you what has been done in the last few days, why it was done, and what the next steps are going to be. I recognize that the many proclamations from state capitals and from Washington, the legislation, the Treasury regulations, and so forth, ought to be explained to the people of this country. Because of an undermined confidence on the part of the public, there was a general rush by a large portion of our population to turn bank deposits into currency or gold. A rush so great that the soundest banks could not get enough currency to meet the demand. The bank holiday, while resulting in many cases in great inconvenience, is affording us the opportunity to supply the currency necessary to meet the situation. No sound bank is a dollar worse off than it was when it closed its doors. The new law allows the 12 Federal Reserve banks to issue additional currency on good assets, and thus the banks that reopen will be able to meet every legitimate call. It is possible, of course, in a very few places, that when the banks resume, a very few people who have not recovered from their fear may again begin withdrawals. Let me make it clear that the banks will take care of all needs, and it is my belief that hoarding during the past week has become an exceedingly unfashionable pastime. It needs no prophet to tell you that when the people find that they can get their money, that they can get it when they want it for all legitimate purposes, the phantom of fear will soon be laid. I can assure you that it is safer for you to keep your money in a reopened bank than to keep it under the mattress. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
That's FDR in his first fireside chat, part of the holdings at the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York, which you're seeing on your screen. And inside the library in the research room, we're going to introduce you to another of the library's senior staffers. His name is Bob Clark, and he is the supervisory archivist for the FDR Presidential Library. Mr. Clark, good evening. Thanks for being with us.
Good evening, Susan. I'm glad to be with you.
Well, these fireside chats, how did they actually get their name, and when did FDR realize he was onto something?
Well, he really came up with at least the concept of what became known as the fireside chat during the governorship years when he was governor of New York State. He started to realize the power of radio during that time, and when he took office, he understood that up until that time, the federal government had not really involved the people of the United States in their government. So what he did is he crafted these 30 fireside chats, and out of the 100 of speeches that he gave throughout his presidency, only about 30 are known as fireside chats. And while he was crafting them, he put himself as if he was in somebody's kitchen or in their living room, speaking directly to them individually. So he used common language, slower pacing, allusions to basic American history that people might know, invocations to God. He called them my friends, and he referred to himself as I, and to the American people as you. So he was really making a personal connection with them. When he was ready to deliver the third fireside chat in May of 1933, the term actually came about because somebody with CBS Radio wanting to issue a press release to get the people ready for the broadcast coined the phrase fireside chat. And it fits so well with what Roosevelt was trying to do that the name stuck, and the president himself liked it, and so his speechwriters, as they were drafting these special speeches, used the term themselves.
About how many homes were there in the United States in 1933, and what percentage of them had radio?
There was about 60% of the population that had radio, and that steadily increased as Roosevelt's presidency continued, so that almost every radio or every house in the country had radio. And the legend is that when President Roosevelt was delivering one of these fireside chats, If it was a nice summer day and everyone's windows were open, you could literally walk down a block of houses and never miss a word of the speech because everybody was tuning into it.
And when we saw it on film, how did the film work into the process?
Well, that's very interesting, and it shows what a master of communication Roosevelt really was, because most of the people were going to hear the speech live on the radio. But what Roosevelt did is he took the speech, and I've got the reading copy of the first fireside chat that you just listened to a little bit ago. What he would do is he would select 4 or 5 excerpts from that speech so that he could read those for the newsreel companies. Those would then go into the newsreel theaters the following week, and people on average saw 3 or 4 movies a week. They cost a dime. And so he was really controlling the message from his speech for an entire week, and what president today wouldn't want to do that?
Well, 2 things related to the first fireside chat that I know you have for us is, first of all, public reaction to his chat.
Sure, the public reaction was overwhelming because the government, a representative of the government had never reached out to the people like that. In the first 2 weeks of the Roosevelt administration, the White House was flooded with mail. They received about 450,000 letters from the public, and in a country of about 130 million, that's an incredible number. Herbert Hoover had only 1 correspondence secretary. Roosevelt had to hire 70 more. And every time there was a fireside chat, the public would just flood the White House with reaction mail. And I've got one that I want to share with you because I think you immediately see what connection Roosevelt established. And this is a reaction letter to the first fireside chat that you just heard. And the quote is just amazing from the first paragraph. It reads, "The president of the greatest nation on earth honored every home with a personal visit last night. He came into our living room in a kindly, neighborly way, and in simple words explained the great things he had done so that all of us unfamiliar with the technicalities might understand. When his voice died away, we realized our friend had gone home again, but left us his courage, his faith, and absolute confidence." And that's reflective of all of the letters that came in to Roosevelt after that first fireside chat.
Well, you're going to be showing us a lot more tonight. Tell us a little bit about some of the stacks and the secrets that they hold.
Sure. As Cynthia mentioned in her piece, we have about 17 million pages of manuscript material here, and that material is kept in locked stacks. The room I'm in is the Arthur Schlesinger Reading Room, and this is where students, scholars, and the researching public would come to work with those materials. There's always an archivist here on duty to help them access those. In addition, we have a wonderful book collection of about 50,000 volumes, 17,000 of which are Roosevelt's own personal library. And he designed his stack areas, actually, to give you the sense of being inside a naval vessel because he loved all things having to do with the Navy. So as you walk through the stacks, you get the feeling that you're inside the decks of a ship.
Well, tell us about yourself because we're going to be spending a couple of hours with you this evening. Where's home for you originally, and how'd you get into this line of work?
Well, I was born and raised in Texas, and as a history student, I needed a job, and there was a wonderful facility at my alma mater, Texas Tech University, that collected materials on the history of the Southwest. And they were kind enough to hire me as a student assistant, and I just kind of kept moving up the ladder there as I reached another level of education in the history program. I took a break from that and became a lawyer for a while, but then the opportunity came to work at a presidential library, and an amazing one dedicated to 2 extraordinary people like Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and I hopped at the chance.
Another one of those reformed lawyers out there.
That's right.
Well, later on, in just a little while, I know you'll be taking our viewers inside the stacks in the part of the library that only few people get to see, and we look forward to that. Right now, it's time to show people another bit of video, and this is from the New Deal era. Richard Norton Smith, our historian, the New Deal is a phrase that even people that don't study a lot of history are familiar with, but what should they know about it?
Well, in the 1932 campaign, Roosevelt had said almost offhandedly that he pledged himself to a New Deal for the American people. The phrase caught on, and it became indelible, along with the 100 days. The notion, even now, no president can take office without having his first 100 days assessed. That's part of the Roosevelt legacy. Right before he became president, Roosevelt was telling an aide, they were going over the program, he said, let's concentrate on one thing. Let's save the people and the country, and if that means that we change our minds twice a day, so be it. Again, the great contrast with Hoover, who had raised principle to the level of intransigence. Roosevelt was a great improviser. And the New Deal that he's talking about in the 15 bills in the first 100 days, the banking bill, for example, was passed by both houses of Congress in one day. There wasn't even a reading copy of the bill. Wouldn't happen today. But much about the New Deal, the early New Deal, is contradictory. Some of it is inflationary, some of it is deflationary, but all of it ministers to the popular need, the popular demand for action, and action now.
Well, let's listen in, and this is one of those excerpts or artifacts from the library where you'll see it both on film and also some that is audio only.
On a Sunday night, a week after my inauguration, I used the radio to tell you about the banking crisis and about the measures we were taking to meet it. Tonight, 8 weeks later, I come for the second time to give you my report, to tell you about what we have been doing and what we are planning to do. 2 months ago, as you know, we were facing serious problems. The country was dying by inches. A prompt program, applied as quickly as possible, seemed to me not only justified, but imperative to our national security. The legislation that has been passed, or is in the process of enactment, can properly be considered as part of a well-grounded, well-rounded plan. First, we are giving opportunity of employment to 250,000 of the unemployed, especially the young men who have dependents, to let them go into forestry and flood prevention work. Secondly, I have requested the Congress and have secured action upon a proposal to put the great properties owned by our government at Muscle Shoals to work after long years of wasteful inaction. And with this goes hand in hand a broad plan for the permanent improvement of the vast area included in the whole of the Tennessee Valley. Next, the Congress is about to pass legislation that will greatly ease the mortgage distress among the farmers and among the homeowners of the nation. Our next step in seeking immediate relief is a grant of $500 million to help the states and the counties and the municipalities in their duty to care for those who at this time need direct and immediate relief. We are planning within a few days to ask the Congress for legislation to enable the government to undertake public works, thus stimulating directly and indirectly the employment of many others in well-considered projects. Well-considered and conservative measures will likewise be proposed within a few days that will attempt to give to the industrial workers of the country a more fair wage return, to prevent cutthroat competition, to prevent unduly long hours for labor, and at the same time to encourage each industry to prevent overproduction. We are working towards a definite goal, a goal that seeks to prevent the return of conditions which came very close to destroying what you and I call modern civilization.
And right now we return to FDR's study at his library, and the next guest you'll meet is Herman Eberhardt, who is the top curator at the FDR Library. And Mr. Eberhardt, you've got some artifacts right there in the room that connect us to this period of time, the New Deal and the Works Progress Administration.
Yes. Actually, in that speech you just heard, Roosevelt, of course, is in the middle of the first 100 days, but the New Deal, of course, was a work in progress. And some of the most important legislation of the New Deal actually came in a couple of years later in 1935 with the Wagner Act, with Social Security, and also with the Works Progress Administration, which was the most massive of the programs that Roosevelt created to provide jobs to Americans during the Great Depression. And right here in the study, which I think is really, we like to think of it as the largest artifact in the museum collection, it reflects so many aspects of Roosevelt, but it also reflects aspects of his New Deal. For example, the draperies up here on the windows were actually created by workers who were working in Virginia as part of a crafts project associated with the WPA.
What else do you have?
Well, over here on the table, we have a number of artifacts, but I want to just focus on this one right here. Of course, Roosevelt's programs are helping literally millions of people around the country, and many of them, in order to sort of express their gratitude to the president, sent Roosevelt gifts. Among the most elaborate and really beautiful, I would argue, in our entire collection is this beautiful wooden piece, which was crafted by a young woman named Ernestine Guerrero, who lived in San Antonio, Texas, and her family had been helped during the depths of the Depression by Roosevelt's New Deal and the relief programs of the New Deal, and she was looking for a way to express her thanks to the president, so she did something rather interesting. A lot of the relief that the family had been getting had come in wooden boxes. This would have been food, literally, that they were existing on, that was coming from relief provided through state aid that was coming down through Washington. And what she did was she took pieces of these boxes, these grocery boxes, and she created this magnificent sculptural piece which is called the Chimes of Normandy. And she sent it to the president in 1937. And he not only acknowledged it, when this museum opened in 1941, he placed it on display.
Well, two other things, since we heard from Richard Norton Smith about the importance on the president of his bout with polio and how it really shaped the rest of his life. You've got two artifacts in the room right there that were part of how the president used, what he used to move himself around, both on feet and in the wheelchair. Can you show us both of those?
Yes, maybe we'll start with the wheelchair. This wheelchair was the one that the president used when he was here in the library. There are similar ones that he used in the home, which is about 150 yards from here, the White House, and of course down in Warm Springs, Georgia, at his retreat down there. What's interesting about it is its design. He took an ordinary household chair, cut off the legs, and had it mounted to this frame by a craftsman. And then a little addition here that was put on by the workers at the library, this is back in the 1940s, is this little ashtray which was attached to the frame. Important thing to note about how he would have used this wheelchair. He wouldn't have spent a lot of time sitting in it. In this kind of setting, he would have used it to get from one place to the other. He would have spent more time in this room sitting at his desk behind me here, or in these chairs that are set around the room. This was a way to get from point to point. One other thing I wanted to show you over here, the library, in our collection in the museum, we have 7 pairs of the president's steel or aluminum braces. He used different materials over the years. This is one pair, and these would have been, he would have had to put these on in order to be able to stand up in public. And of course, it was a tremendous weight. These weighed 10 pounds, and you can imagine having to put those on in order to stand up in public and you know, deliver speeches and appear at events. We have other pair, but this one is again, I think they're all fascinating. And he did tinker with the design over time, use different materials. This particular pair are made of steel. Well,
thanks so much there, and so little time. We'll be back to you later on in the program. Our next piece of video has to deal with the period in the Roosevelt presidency known by critics as court packing, by the president himself as judicial reorganization.
It illustrates, again, another part of the Roosevelt legacy: beware of second terms and beware of hubris. FDR won an extraordinary victory in November 1936. He took 46 of 48 states against Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, and huge Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. He used one of his wonderful homely analogies. He talked about a 3-horse team, and 2 of the horses, himself and Congress, were pulling in the same direction. The 3rd horse, unfortunately, the judiciary, and particularly the Supreme Court, was not. In fact, the Supreme Court, the so-called 9 old men, had struck down a number of measures in the New Deal, most notably the National Recovery Administration. And so FDR came up with an ingenious, and until he sprang the surprise in this speech, secret proposal to, quote, reform the judiciary.
Well, let's listen in to how FDR described his plan for the judiciary to the nation.
Tonight, sitting at my desk in the White House, I make my first radio report to the people in my 2nd term of office. I want to talk with you very simply tonight about the need for present action, the need to meet the unanswered challenge of 1/3 of a nation ill-nourished, ill-clad, ill-housed. The courts, however, have cast doubts on the ability of the elected Congress to protect us against catastrophe by meeting squarely our modern social and economic conditions. In the last 4 years, the sound rule of giving statutes the benefit of all reasonable doubt has been cast aside. The court has been acting not as a judicial body, but as a policy-making body. We have therefore reached the point as a nation where we must take action to save the Constitution from the court and the court from itself. What is my proposal? It is simply this. Whenever a judge or justice of any federal court has reached the age of 70 and does not avail himself of the opportunity to retire on a pension, a new member shall be appointed by the President then in office with the approval, as required by the Constitution, of the Senate of the United States. This plan will save our national Constitution from hardening of the judicial arteries.
Those opposing the plan have sought to arouse prejudice and fear by crying that I am seeking to pack the Supreme Court and that a baneful precedent will be established. What do they mean by the words packing the Supreme Court? Let me answer this question with a bluntness that will end all honest misunderstanding of my purpose. If by that phrase, packing the court, it is charged that I wish to place on the bench spineless puppets who would disregard the law and would decide specific cases as I wished them to be decided, I make this answer, that no president fit for his office would appoint, and no Senate of honorable men fit for their office would confirm that kind of appointees to the Supreme Court of the United States. We want a Supreme Court which will do justice under the Constitution and not over it. In our courts, we want a government of laws and not of men.
And here we are talking about FDR. Back to the research room at the library. Bob Clark has for us a bit of some of the reaction to the public reaction to the court packing process.
Roosevelt was quite frankly taken by surprise by the vehement public and press reaction negative towards the court packing plan because, as Richard mentioned, Roosevelt had been overwhelmingly re-elected. 46 of 48 states had voted for Roosevelt, and it was a strong, hearty endorsement for Roosevelt's New Deal actions. The reason why he was proposing the plan was because the New Deal itself was very threatened, but the press reaction really caught him off guard, as illustrated by this cartoon here that we have in one of our wonderful cartoon collections. You can see that Roosevelt is on the steamroller of Congress trying to flatten the Supreme Court here at the bottom, with Congress looking on in dismay. But I think the point needs to be made, and I have another cartoon here that does make the point, which is that this cartoon is reminding people that what the Supreme Court is doing is undercutting the New Deal. And if it hadn't been for both Roosevelt's overwhelming re-election as well as the pressure that was put on the Supreme Court, that switch in time where the Supreme Court changed its judicial philosophy, accepting the role of government in economic affairs, we may not have had the Social Security Act, and that's what Roosevelt really feared.
Well, Mr. Clark, so far we've been showing people in the audio and video realm the fireside chats. We're going to move into another part here with a different kind of archival document, and that is a set of recordings that were made in the Oval Office. Tell us a little bit about this whole recording process.
This was very unique, and it really was an experiment that came out of a fit of pique that Roosevelt had with a senator who went out after a White House conference and misquoted him egregiously on a point of national defense. That was in 1939. As the election of 1940 came about, Roosevelt was very concerned that he might be misquoted in the press because, I'm sure as Richard Norton Smith will talk about, isolationism was a very big issue, and he wanted to make sure that he wasn't misquoted. So Roosevelt and his stenographer searched about for a solution to this, and the idea was to use an experimental recording device with a microphone placed in the lamp of FDR's Oval Office desk. And we actually have the Oval Office desk here in the museum. The microphone cord then ran down the desk, down through a hole in the floor of the Oval Office to the machine down below. there was a manual on-off switch that either Roosevelt or his stenographer had to flip to turn the machine off and on. And of course, after the press conferences were done, sometimes the microphone was left on, and so some additional conversations inside the Oval Office were captured accidentally.
Well, this first one we're going to hear is one of those accidental recordings, I believe, right after the 1940 election. This was, at the time, congressional leaders, including the Speaker of the House, Sam Rayburn, and the House Majority Leader, John McCormack, were in the room, and FDR was talking about his election and his opponent, Wendell Willkie. Let's take a listen.
Now, this morning, it's a terrible attack on Lehman, because what Lehman said is that the Axis powers, there's no question about it, would give anything in the world to have me licked on the 5th of November. And the Times yesterday morning comes out with one of those editorials. Well, what Lehman says. Well, how did we get that way? What do you mean that the Axis powers want to defeat the president? Why, you're insinuating that they are taking a course of interference in our local affairs, and that they and Willkie had some kind of an arrangement. Well, little Lehman said, no, I'm not such a thing about they and Willkie have an arrangement. I am merely making the statement that they went 1 hour to beat. Times said, well, you have no authority for saying a dreadful thing like that. This morning, front page of the Times, Herbert R. Matthews, Rome, October 3rd, while it's the New York Times. Moreover, this is about this meeting of Hitler and Mussolini. Moreover, and this ought to be used. I don't know if Steve was going to tell Jimmy about it in the Senate. I don't know if we can get in the House yet again. Moreover, the Axis is out to defeat President Roosevelt, not as a measure of interference in the internal policy of the United States, but because the President's foreign policy, and because of everything for which he stands in the eyes of the Italians and Germans. The coming United States election is realized to be of vast importance to the Axis. Therefore, the normal strategy for the Axis is to do something before November 5th that would somehow have a great effect on the electoral campaign. Now, that isn't substantiation for what Lehman said.
Writing from Rome.
Huh?
He's writing from Rome.
Writing from Rome.
They didn't say anything about Landon's statement where he deliberately accused you. I was fired with him because I had a very high regard for him. I didn't think Landon would stoop so low as even for political reasons to make the statement, the deliberate statement that you were trying to drag the United States into war. You saw that statement, didn't you, Mr. President? I thought that was vicious.
Well, now, I mean, that's a damn good thing, because that's quoting the front page of the Times against the editorial page of the Times, which is very amusing. Well, they'd give anything in the world to get that fellow elected. Of course, the trouble with Willkie, as you know, in his whole campaign, the reason he's losing, is that he will say anything to please the individual or the audience. Now,
this seems like a good time to tell you that for those of you history buffs that just can't get enough of this first-person history, we have a chock-full website at cspan.org/presidential libraries. In the course of the 1 year of preparation for this with the 12 presidential libraries, we have brought back, with the help of the archivists and curators, more than 1,000 different artifacts and documents, and they are all posted on this website by president, so you can hear more for yourself. Richard Norton-Smith, let's go back to that piece of audio we just heard. What's significant about it?
Well, first of all, presidents have been arguing about the New York Times for a very long time, apparently. Secondly, who's Wendell Willkie? Wendell Willkie is, in some ways, the most unusual presidential nominee of the 20th century. Rumpled, bear-like, charismatic, product of small-town Indiana, moved to New York, became a lawyer and a utilities executive. Was a Democrat for most of his life, but he'd become a very articulate critic of the New Deal. And because of the war in Europe, by the spring of 1940, the same factors that led FDR to break the third-term tradition also led the Republican Party at the last minute to nominate this, as I say, extraordinarily unlikely candidate. But he ran FDR a much closer race than Landon had. What you heard on that tape also, first of all, is a great political strategist, but also a man who's a little bit rattled, because Wendell Willkie had an ability to reach out beyond the traditional Republican ranks. And for a while during the 1940 campaign, he actually seemed to pose a real threat to FDR.
Well, let's listen to this very brief bit of tape, just 35 seconds. It's now only a month out, less than a month out from the 1940 elections, and you can hear the president's increasing concern about the worldwide war and the U.S. position in it.
And the only thing that worries me is that the Germans and the Japs have gone along, and the Italians for, oh, what, 5-6 years, without the hook swimming, without the misjudging foreign opinion. They played a damn smart game. And the time may be coming when the Germans and the Japs will do some fool thing. That's what I think. That's the only real danger about getting in, is that that foot will slip.
Richard Norton Smith, what do you hear in that?
Well, a man who's kind of thinking out loud, spinning scenarios, trying to imagine where events may take him, events beyond his control. Of course, the most dramatic moment at the end of the 1940 campaign, the FDR goes to Boston and he tells an audience, I think at Fenway Park, he assures the mothers and fathers of America that your boys in uniform are not going to be sent overseas to fight in foreign wars. It no doubt contributes to his landslide on Election Day, but in some ways it comes back to haunt him not so long after.
Well, this is time for me to tell you that in just a couple of minutes we're going to be involving you in your phone calls with questions about the FDR presidency. Here are the lines, and you can begin dialing in and get your place in line on the phones. For Democrats, the number 202-737-0001. For Republicans, 202-737-0002. And our line for independent callers, 202-628-0205. And while you're dialing in, let's return to the library. And Herman Eberhardt, you've got some artifacts from the 1940 campaign. Unprecedented third try for the presidency here. What can you show us that will help people understand what the campaign was like?
Well, as has been discussed already, Roosevelt is in a very delicate situation in 1940. I mean, he's dealing with crises not just in Europe, but also crises that are brewing in the Pacific as well. And he really has to thread the needle, so to speak, during that campaign. In addition to all of that, he is breaking this tradition of two terms for presidents that goes all the way back to George Washington. No president prior to Roosevelt had ever done this, been elected to a third term. And so a lot of the campaign memorabilia of that campaign focuses on this, and we have a small selection of them here. A lot of simple no third term, but then you get some interesting things that sort of work their way into the paraphernalia. No royal family. This notion that Roosevelt's setting himself up as royalty almost. This one here is a definite allusion to dictators in Europe. Caution, we need Willkie, not dictatorship. You see a lot of that creeping in to the material in the campaign. No third term sometimes just becomes no. And the 3 stars, obviously, no third term. Here's a pro-Roosevelt button. Better a third termer than a third rater. And I just wanted to point out one other one. We don't want Eleanor either. It's interesting when you look at the paraphernalia, not just of the 1940 campaign, but of other campaigns that Roosevelt ran as well, that Eleanor Roosevelt becomes a lightning rod for critics of Roosevelt and his policies.
Also, I understand that you have in the collection a campaign podium from that campaign that also shows a little bit more of what we were talking about with his special accommodations for his disability.
We have a podium that we recently acquired. We continue to acquire items in the collection, and this podium is quite interesting because it has a rather long set of handrails that extend out from the podium towards where the speaker would be approaching the podium. And obviously it was there to help Roosevelt as he had to steady himself getting towards the podium, and then even during his speaking to be able to have that additional means of support while he was delivering a long political speech.
Well, of course, Roosevelt went on in November to a landslide victory, the Electoral College margin 449 to 82. And at this point, we're going to take a break because we've gotten through the first 2 terms of the Roosevelt presidency and get to your telephone calls. First one up for our 3 guests is from Corpus Christi, Texas. You are on the air.
Yes, my question was, how did the president come about with the idea about the Social Security program? Did somebody lead him on to that, or was that his original idea? That's all. Thank you.
Richard Norton-Smith.
Well, first of all, the rest of the world, the industrial world, was ahead of the United States, most notably Great Britain, Germany, indeed, in the 19th century. One thing we haven't talked about, however, as a source of ideas, Roosevelt also invented what's called the brain trust, the idea of bringing intellectuals, academics, experts into the government, not simply in an advisory capacity, but full-time. And he tapped into a number of people at Columbia University, which is where he went to law school. And that's where a lot of the ideas for the New Deal came. Social Security specifically, maybe someone out there would like to tackle that.
Herman Eberhardt, do you have anything on Social Security for us?
Any artifacts to show you?
Anything?
No, unfortunately I don't.
Okay. Well, we'll move on to another telephone call. This is from Queens, New York. Queens, you are on the air. Go ahead, please.
Hello?
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm on the air. I was up to your house the other day in the...
Caller, you know what your problem is you've got your TV volume up. Turn it down real quickly and get your question.
Sure.
Caller, you know what your problem is you've got your TV volume up. All right. Turn it down real quickly and get...
I was in the library the other day, and I didn't see that special display.
Which display are you talking about?
On the right-hand side, in the room there, his office room, they had the special display there.
And what was it about?
It just said some woman from Texas, and the authorities sent him this, with the bell in the tower there.
And you did not see it there?
No, I did not see it, and I was there Thursday.
Well, that's right. That's what this whole series is about, to show you things that are not generally on public display. Herman Eberhardt, you want to explain a little bit about how this is curated at the library?
Sure. We have 35,000 items in our collection, and only a very small percentage of those are out at any given time on display. The piece that I showed earlier that the woman on the phone is referring to, what has been on display for many years in the past in the library's exhibits, and we hope to have it out again in the future. But we replace things on a regular basis, try to keep the exhibits fresh, and have a variety of things that people can see, hopefully so that when they come back on a second visit or a third visit, they're seeing something new.
Bob Clark, I got a note that you do have something about Social Security for that viewer.
That's right, Susan. I actually have the signing statement that Roosevelt read when he signed the Social Security Act in August of 1935, and I think if I can read the first few lines of this, it really summarizes Roosevelt's vision for the Social Security Act. And it reads, "Today a hope of many years' standing is in large part fulfilled. The civilization of the past 100 years, with its startling industrial changes, has tended more and more to make life insecure. Young people have come to wonder what would be their lot when they came to old age. The man with a job has wondered how long the job would last. This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 million of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health."
Next telephone call is from Pensacola, Florida.
Yes, my name is Mary Edwards, and I'm in Pensacola, and I was born the year he became president, 1933. And I know I remember as a little girl singing the song Shanty in Old Shantytown, but I didn't know where it came from until I started watching C-SPAN and I heard about the bonus army. And then later how they were many of them were killed in the hurricane at Key West. I would like to know why, if you have any information that tells you why the president did not support making payments to the bonus army from World War I at $1. I believe it was $1 for every day served in the war. Do you have any information on why he would have done that? And also, if I remember from watching C-SPAN, that he also had, I believe it was General MacArthur, or one of the generals, that he actually, when they were marching on Washington, that he stopped that march. Do you have it? And I'll hang up and listen to your answer. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. Why don't we stay with Bob Clark on the bonus army?
Sure, that's a great question, and I think that the caller may have two presidents confused, but because the bonus army issue crossed over two administrations. Keep in mind that the whole idea behind the New Deal was not to just establish a dole where money would be handed out to people. Roosevelt's vision for the New Deal was much broader than that. He didn't want to just target specific special interest groups. He wanted to establish programs that helped a broad audience. The issue with the bonus army really arose during the Hoover administration, and then there were two encampments in Washington. The one that the caller is recalling, where General MacArthur was called out to clear the encampment from Washington, was actually done by Herbert Hoover, and General MacArthur was the chief of staff of the Army at the time. A second encampment came during the Roosevelt, the first few weeks of the Roosevelt administration, but rather than sending out the Army, FDR actually sent Mrs. Roosevelt, and so the old saw was that Hoover sent MacArthur and Roosevelt sent his wife. Roosevelt met with representatives of that, and the bonus army disbanded peacefully.
And it's interesting. I mean, one of the paradoxes of this paradoxical man is, in many ways, personally, he was very fiscally orthodox. He kept trying to get back to a balanced budget. Remember, in 1932, he promised a 25% reduction in federal expenditures. And one of the debates that went on within the administration, and it really bore, in some ways, disastrous fruit in the second term, FDR wanted to get beyond these huge expenditures and move much closer toward a balanced budget. Actually, when they did it, it brought about a severe recession in 1937 and 38.
Wichita, Kansas is our next question on FDR.
Yes, my question is, can you draw any contrast or simulate or similar tactics used by Republicans to viciously attack the way they did FDR and the way they attacked Bill Clinton? I mean, they were popular with the people, yet Republicans went after them day after day, week after week, month after month for their entire terms as president. And I'll take my answer off the air.
Thanks very much. That's a Richard Norton Smith question.
Oh, boy. Well, they're polarizing figures, ma'am. They're historically significant. FDR, frankly, shattered the political consensus that he found. I mean, he changed this country profoundly. You can debate over the effect of the New Deal, whether it solved the Depression. You can do all sorts of argument with statistics, but I don't think anyone really will debate the fact that the New Deal transformed the relationship of the average citizen to his government. That's a revolutionary change, and it's not surprising that a lot of people might oppose the revolution.
Mark Farkas is our executive producer for this 12-part series, and our producer for the FDR installment is Russell Logan, who is in Hyde Park tonight. Our next telephone call is from Chicago. You're on the air.
Yes, I would like to find out if there's any possible reason why President Roosevelt did not allow the Jewish people to come into the United States who are being persecuted by Hitler.
Bob Clark, would you talk a little bit about that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The issue, the refugee issue, and then the subsequent issue that comes out of that, which is the Holocaust issue, is a very difficult one, and it's one that is intensely debated today. Specifically with regard to the refugee issue, I think it's important to understand that what Roosevelt was dealing with was not only a depression, also a very isolationist country that was looking only inward at itself and trying to fix its own problems. And there were also very strict immigration quotas in place at the time that really dated from the days of Warren Harding and Calvin Coolidge that simply didn't give Roosevelt the flexibility to permit a large number of refugees in from any country. And the stringency of those laws really restricted him from using the flexibility of government that you tend to see during the New Deal.
Rochester, New York, your question.
Hi. Earlier in the broadcast, you mentioned that President Roosevelt was going to be working on his memoirs after he retired. Did he begin anything? Is there any written record of his beginning his memoirs? I'll take my answer off the air.
Herman Everhart.
I think I can answer that partly, and then maybe I'll throw it to Bob. But he certainly didn't ever write his memoirs. But I believe, and Bob might correct me on this, that he had been either signed a contract or at one point was contemplating a contract for a series of magazine articles that he was going to write after he left the presidency that would, I guess, be part of a project aimed at writing his autobiography. But certainly he never published an autobiography.
Bob, do you have anything to add?
I do. Herman's correct that the president had signed a contract to write some Collier's articles after he was intending to retire after the end of his second term. But Roosevelt himself was just an awful diarist. At periods in his life, he would sporadically start a diary at the beginning of the year, and it would generally trickle out by the middle of January. He just wasn't disciplined or interested enough in looking back and writing a diary.
Well, we've fast-forwarded through the first two terms of the FDR administration, focusing on the economy in the United States and the prelude to war. We're going to take a short break and then be back with all of our guests in Hyde Park, New York, and Richard Norton-Smith here in our studio in Washington for our second hour, which focuses on the U.S. entry into World War II.
As part of the Presidential Library series, C-SPAN Radio will air 3 of FDR's fireside chats. His September 3rd, 1939 address after Germany invaded Poland to start World War II. The December 9th, 1941 address following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And his report on the progress of the war from February 23rd, 1942. You can also hear remarks by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, as well as an interview with Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential historian James McGregor Burns. That's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential libraries. And next Friday, we'll be live from the Harry Truman Presidential Library in Independence, Missouri. During the 2-hour program, we'll look at the leadership style of our nation's 33rd president through rare film and sound recordings, letters, documents, and artifacts collected from the stacks and vaults of the library. That's next Friday at 8 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN. And you can see tonight's program on the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library in its entirety, beginning at 11 p.m. Eastern, here on C-SPAN.
How do you justify sanctioning CBS in circumstances where it had no prior knowledge that the event was going to take place and that was deliberately concealed from them?
Today at 7 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN's America and the Courts. Oral argument from the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Philadelphia. CBS versus FCC, the Janet Jackson Super Bowl indecency case.
CBS had knowledge of the event in the sense that the performers were part of CBS for purposes of this event.
CBS versus FCC, today at 7 Eastern on C-SPAN's America and the Courts. You can also listen to America and the Courts each week on C-SPAN Radio, on XM Satellite Radio.
Now we continue with the C-SPAN series, Presidential Libraries, History Uncovered, from the Franklin Roosevelt Library in Hyde Park, New York, exploring the career of our 32nd president.
This is Leon Pearson speaking for the Pan American Coffee Bureau, which represents 7 good neighbor coffee-growing nations, and presenting to you American families your Sunday evening visit with Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm speaking to you tonight at a very serious moment in our history. The Cabinet is convening and the leaders in Congress are meeting with the President. The State Department and Army and Navy officials have been with the President all afternoon. In fact, the Japanese ambassador was talking to the President at the very time that Japan's airships were bombing our citizens in Hawaii and the Philippines and sinking one of our transports loaded with lumber on its way to Hawaii. By tomorrow morning, the members of Congress will have a full report and be ready for action. In the meantime, we, the people, are already prepared for action. For months now, the knowledge that something of this kind might happen has been hanging over our heads, and yet it seemed impossible to believe, impossible to drop the everyday things of life and feel that there was only one thing which was important: preparation to meet an enemy, no matter where he struck. That is all over now, and there is no more uncertainty. We know what we have to face, and we know that we are ready to face it. I should like to say just a word to the women in the country tonight. I have a boy at sea on a destroyer. For all I know, he may be on his way to the Pacific. 2 of my children are in coast cities on the Pacific. Many of you all over this country have boys in the services who will now be called upon to go into action. You have friends and families in what has suddenly become a danger zone. You cannot escape anxiety. You cannot escape a clutch of fear at your heart. And yet I hope that the certainty of what we have to meet will make you rise above these fears. We must go about our daily business more determined than ever to do the ordinary things as well as we can. And when we find a way to do anything more in our communities to help others, to build morale, to give a feeling of security, we must do it. Whatever is asked of us, I am sure we can accomplish it. We are the free and unconquerable people of the United States of America. To the young people of the nation, I must speak a word tonight. You are going to have a great opportunity. There will be high moments in which your strength and your ability will be tested. I have faith in you. I feel as though I was standing upon a rock. That rock is my faith in my fellow citizens. Now we will go back to the program which we had arranged for tonight.
And that, of course, is First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and one of the rarely heard artifacts gathered from the vaults of the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York. Welcome back to our 2-hour program from the FDR Library as we continue our 12-week series on modern presidential history. And during the second hour, we'll continue to play for you rare audio and video from the library's collection and show you special documents and artifacts from the stacks and the vaults. You're looking at a picture of the library in Hyde Park, and inside in the research room at the FDR Library is Bob Clark, one of our 2 special guests from the library this evening. And Mr. Clark, I want to really have you set the stage for people. That's really a remarkable piece of audio that we just heard. The nation has just been attacked, and the First Lady of the United States, even before the President, speaks to the public. Help set the stage for why that decision was made.
That's one of my favorite pieces in our collection, is that recording of Mrs. Roosevelt on the night after the Pearl Harbor attack. And it wasn't planned that way by the administration. Mrs. Roosevelt actually had a weekly radio program where she went on the air and spoke to American families about issues of home and family. When the attack happened, when word came to Washington of the attack in the afternoon of December 7th, Mrs. Roosevelt set aside her planned script and chose to stay on the air to talk to the American people about the attack, to calm their hearts, to bring them together as a nation. And it's extraordinary that Mrs. Roosevelt was the first public figure associated with the Roosevelt administration who spoke to the nation about the attack.
I got to get Richard Norton Smith in here real briefly, because at the time, was it perpetually analyzed in the same way that the current administration's response on the 9/11 attacks has been? Who spoke at what time, where the president was, that sort of thing?
No, you mean how the news would be
and the First Lady being the one to speak to the nation?
No, I think it was much more. I mean, literally, the nation was taken by surprise. The remarkable thing, of course, is the institutionalization of the modern First Lady job, however you want to define it. Like FDR invented the modern presidency, there's no doubt that Eleanor Roosevelt reinvented this job of First Lady. She's the first First Lady to have regular press conferences and, of course, radio programs. In fact, it was a source of pride to her that her radio audiences were larger than the president's.
Bob Clark, I'm going to have you do some walking and talking, because I know you're going to take us into the Eleanor Roosevelt collection. As you're doing that, do the impossible. Just give us a couple of highlights about Eleanor Roosevelt, because this program can't begin to do justice to her.
Sure. What I'd like to do is I'd like to take you into the attic stack area where we house Eleanor Roosevelt's papers. And these 3 million pages of papers document just the extraordinary life of this woman. They document everything from her youth and education through her partnership with FDR in the governorship and the presidency. But then people must remember that after FDR died on April 12, 1945, she had another 17 years of a public career where she was the first woman delegate to the United Nations. She was a leader in the Democratic Party. She was a prolific author and writer, and she was really a civil rights activist throughout her entire life. And one of the real treasures that we have in the collection relates and reflects Mrs. Roosevelt's interest in advancing the cause of civil rights in America. You may, and the audience may know of the episode where the African-American contralto Marian Anderson was denied the use of Constitution Hall because she was African American. And Constitution Hall was owned by the Daughters of the American Revolution. Mrs. Roosevelt was a member of that organization, although she wasn't a particularly active member of that organization. When they denied Marian Anderson use of that hall on Easter Sunday because of her race, Mrs. Roosevelt attempted to change their mind on that, but when the DAR refused to do so, Mrs. Roosevelt saw no other course but to resign from that organization. And this is really one of the most important documents we have, not only in the history of Eleanor Roosevelt, but also in the history of civil rights in America. Because what she says in the second paragraph is, "I am in complete disagreement with the attitude taken in refusing Constitution Hall to a great artist. You have set an example which seems to me unfortunate, and I feel obliged to send in to you my resignation. You had an opportunity to lead in an enlightened way, and it seems to me that your organization has failed." But what Mrs. Roosevelt then did after the resignation was she worked behind the scenes with the Secretary of the Interior to arrange for a monumental concert by Marian Anderson on Easter Sunday on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial that was attended by thousands and thousands of people of both black and white color, and that was heard in a radio audience of millions around the world. So in addition to her subtle attempt to persuade by resigning, she worked publicly to make an even larger statement through the Easter Sunday concert.
What else do you have for us for Eleanor Roosevelt?
Well, of course, the speech that we just heard on Pearl Harbor Day inevitably leads to a discussion of what happened domestically with regard to civil liberties after Pearl Harbor, and that was the unfortunate internment of about 110,000 Japanese Americans. Mrs. Roosevelt, given her desire to advance civil rights in the United States, was very troubled by the decision of the administration to intern Japanese Americans, but she felt constrained because of the military situation from disagreeing openly with the president. One of the things that I want to show you is a wonderful recent addition to our collection, which is one of the posters that was posted around the West Coast announcing to Japanese Americans that they had to gather in certain places so that they could be moved to the interior of the country. Not only do we have this in English, but we also have one that is in Japanese as well. What Mrs. Roosevelt did in an attempt to make an impact on the Japanese American internment situation is that she worked quietly behind the scenes to try to improve the conditions in the camps, to work with the War Relocation Authority, and particularly Milton Eisenhower, the brother of Dwight Eisenhower, who oversaw it, to try to work early releases for people. She also very publicly visited the camps to show her solidarity with them, and she talked about Japanese Americans' patriotism in her daily column, My Day, in an effort to have public opinion out ahead of the administration and therefore pull the administration along with it.
And because we're not going to be able to spend much more time on what was an extraordinarily long career, Mrs. Roosevelt, after the death of her husband in 1945, went on to what kind of life?
When FDR died, she famously told reporters that the story is over, but the story was far from over because President Truman could not think of a better person to appoint to the United Nations, which in and of itself was a vision of her husband. So she became the first woman delegate, and truly as a UN delegate, her greatest accomplishment, as she saw it, was to work with the United Nations for the unanimous passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and that was really the culmination of Mrs. Roosevelt's civil rights work.
Well, we'll see you next back in the FDR Research Room. But as you set the stage for us on the growing discussion on civil rights and race relations, our next piece of vintage audio is on that very topic. It's one of those secretly recorded White House Oval Office conversations, and this is on the subject of race relations with A. Philip Randolph.
Yeah.
Set the stage.
A. Philip Randolph was a very smart, very shrewd, very tough labor organizer. And it cannot be overemphasized the degree to which the New Deal put the government on the side of organized labor. Anyway, A. Philip Randolph was responsible for unionizing the porters, black porters on Pullman train cars, and he became, the union joined the American Federation of Labor, and he himself became one of the most prominent and influential black Americans. By this time, the defense buildup is beginning to gather momentum. And Philip Randolph and Walter White of the NAACP, who's on this tape, and others are very dissatisfied with two things. They're very dissatisfied with the treatment accorded African Americans in the armed forces. There is not a single black Marine or Air Force member. Less than 1% of the Army is black. There are no blacks in combat roles. They dig ditches, they build bridges, they serve food. They wanted to change that. And the other thing was they wanted a share of defense contracts. So they get a meeting with FDR in September 1940, and this is what happens.
This is just under 2 minutes.
President, it would mean a great deal to the morale of the Negro people if you could make some announcement on the role the Negroes would play in the armed forces of the nation.
It's the other day.
National defense setup.
We did it the other day. When God told me this thing.
If you did it yourself. If you were to make such an announcement, it would have a tremendous effect upon the morale
a national defense speech around this month on what about the draft as a whole and the reserves and so forth. I'll bring that in.
It would have a tremendous effect because I might say that it is the irritating spot among the Negro people. They feel that they're not wanted in the various armed forces of the country, and they feel they have earned the right to participate in every phase of the government by virtue of their record in past wars for the nation. And consequently, without regard to political complexion, without regard to any sort of idea whatever, the Negroes were unit, and they're feeling that they're being shut aside, that they're being discriminated against, and that they're not wanted now.
I heard one expression this way, Mr. President, the other day, the Negroes trying to get in the government. He's trying to get in. Of course, not the main point to get across is in building up this draft on selective draft, that we are not, as we did before so much in the World War, confining the Negro into the non-combat services. We're putting them right in, proportionately, into the combat service.
Well, we feel that's
which is something. I mean, it's parity of it's a step ahead. What we want is a step ahead. Just another step ahead.
And once again, we'll remind you that we have the entirety of this and many other resources at our website created just for this series, cspan.org, Presidential Libraries. Richard Norton Smith, talk to us about FDR's overall record on race relations.
Well, it's complex. He was, like all of us, a man of his time and his place. He also felt, in many ways, hamstrung politically, because remember, the Democratic Party was a coalition that depended as much on the Solid South. Very conservative, segregationist, to put it mildly, Democrats who often provided the margin of victory for a Democratic president. So he felt he was constrained there. The best, I suppose, answer to that is the sequel to this meeting, because really nothing, the meeting that we just heard produced nothing. And Philip Randolph and Walter White and others were quite dissatisfied. Randolph basically began to organize a march on Washington. And word of this got to the White House. Mrs. Roosevelt asked her husband to have a second meeting with Philip Randolph. And in the course of that meeting, Randolph, extraordinary scene, basically tells the president, I'm going to bring 100,000 people to march down Pennsylvania Avenue and call attention to this national shame. And as a result of that threat, he gets the president to issue an executive order concerning blacks in defense industries, and also to create something called a Fair Employment Practices Commission to enforce it.
And the library's top curator, Herman Eberhardt, it is in the FDR study at the library with a few artifacts that help us understand this period in history. Mr. Eberhardt?
Yes, well, one of the wonderful collections in the museum is a collection of World War II posters. We have nearly 5,000 posters in our collection, and it's incredibly rich across a wide range of subjects. And I've just pulled a couple for this display that deal with Executive Order 8802 that was just described by Richard Norton Smith. The first one, and this was produced during the war, contains an excerpt from the executive order and then Franklin Roosevelt's name at the end. I do hereby reaffirm the policy of the United States that there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. This was obviously meant to be put up in workplaces proclaiming this executive order. Then you see this sort of thing cropping up during the course of the war. Posters that depict black and white workers working together in a defense industry setting that really personify the goal of this executive order.
We're going to fast forward through history as we continue to do in this series. It's a lot of years to cover with a lot of artifacts, but the next one is December 29th, 1940. Another fireside chat, the first one of FDR's post-election after his historic third term. And this is one that deals with the worsening international situation. This one is a fireside chat on national security called The Arsenal of Democracy. Let's listen in.
How great is our danger, Mr. President? Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization been in such danger as now. But we well know that we cannot escape danger or the fear of it by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads.
What do you believe the dictators want, Mr. President?
The Nazi masters of Germany have made it clear that they intend not only to dominate all life and thought in their own country, but also to enslave the whole of Europe, and then to use the resources of Europe to dominate the rest of the world. The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis. No man can tame a tiger into a kitten by stroking it.
If we do not fight, Mr. President, what protection do we have?
In a military sense, Great Britain and the British Empire are today the spearhead of resistance to world conquest. They are putting up a fight which will live forever in the story of human gallantry.
How then, Mr. President, do you define our national policy?
Our national policy is not directed toward war. Its sole purpose is to keep war away from our country and away from our people. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. There will be no bottlenecks in our determination to aid Great Britain. No dictator, no combination of dictators will weaken that determination by threats of how they will construe that determination.
And for the future, Mr. President?
We have every good reason for hope. Hope for peace. Hope for the defense of our civilization and for the building of a better civilization in the future. I call upon our people with absolute confidence that our common cause will greatly succeed.
Well, of course, less than a year later, the U.S. was fully engaged. But at this point in his presidency, how was FDR trying to position the U.S.?
This is a real turning point. This is one of the most important moments in the Roosevelt presidency. Talk about bully pulpit. That's the bully pulpit in action. And remember, this is 2 months after the 1940 election. FDR once said, it's a terrible thing to look over your shoulder and see no one there. And for several months before that election, he had seemed rather tentative in his approach to this issue. Now he had a mandate. He had won a convincing victory, and this is a much more forceful man than you heard before the 1940 race. The arsenal of democracy is about to transform the American economy. And even as he is delivering this speech, he is preparing a classic Rooseveltian scheme called Lend-Lease. The British were broke. They could not pay for American weaponry if they could get it. So FDR came up with Lend-Lease, and the idea was we would lend them battleships. We would lend them planes. We would lend them artillery pieces. And after the war was over, they would return them to us.
Bob Clark, back at the library, you've got, I'm sure, a vast collection on World War II related documents, but show us a couple that you've picked out for us.
I've got some wonderful documents for you that really cover the entire span that Richard Norton Smith was talking about, from before the outbreak of the war in September of '39 up to Lend-Lease. The first one that I want to show you is an extraordinary letter that FDR wrote to Adolf Hitler in April of 1939. This was at a point when Roosevelt was feeling particularly impotent with regard to what he could do because of the isolationism in the country, as well as the neutrality laws that were preventing him from helping the beleaguered nations overseas. And as you can see on the second page of the letter here, Roosevelt is writing to Adolf Hitler, "The tide of events seems to have reverted to the threat of arms. If such threats continue, it seems inevitable that much of the world must become involved in common ruin. All the world, victor nations, vanquished nations, and neutral nations will suffer. I refuse to believe that the world is, of necessity, such a prisoner of destiny." What Roosevelt then did was propose to Adolf Hitler that he allow FDR to facilitate discussions with over 30 threatened nations, and he asked Hitler to promise not to invade those 30 nations. And of course Hitler then, in a famous speech before the Reichstag, then ridiculed Roosevelt for such a proposal.
What other documents do you want to show us?
Another document that I think is one of the most important documents in our collection as well as in the history of the world is the extraordinary letter that Albert Einstein sent to FDR in August of 1939. Because of the outbreak of the war, though, the letter wasn't delivered till October. But what this letter did was warn Franklin Roosevelt of the dangers of uranium-based weapons. And I just want to read a couple of sentences from the beginning of the letter. It reads, "Some recent work by Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, which has been communicated to me in manuscript, leads me to expect that the element uranium may be turned into a new and important source of energy in the immediate future. Certain aspects of the situation which has arisen seem to call for watchfulness and, if necessary, quick action on the part of the administration." Einstein then goes on to describe the possibilities of a massive weapon of destructive power. It was this letter that Roosevelt handed to an aide and said, "See that this gets done," that then resulted in the Manhattan Project and the launching of the nuclear age.
The next one is will really catch people's attention, I think.
This is just an incredible moment in history. This is what's referred to as the bedside note. FDR received word by telephone of the invasion of Poland by Hitler on September 1st, 1939. He was awakened in bed by one of his ambassadors. And thinking of posterity and of history, the president pulled a sheet of paper from his bedside table and wrote this amazing note, interestingly enough, in the third person, referring to himself as the president. It reads, "The president received word at 2:50 a.m. by telephone from Ambassador Biddle through Ambassador Bullitt that Germany has invaded Poland and that 4 cities are being bombed. The president directed that all Navy ships and Army commands be notified by radio at once." And then in the bottom corner you see he's written in bed, 3:05 a.m., September 1st, 1939, FDR. A real snapshot in time.
And the FDR's letter to Hitler himself, how did such letters get passed between leaders?
Those would have passed through diplomatic channels. You know, there was the issue of ambassadors at the time and who was sharing what ambassadors, but that would have passed through diplomatic channels.
And how long would it take to deliver such a letter?
That was delivered fairly promptly because, of course, it would have been transmitted by cable and then delivered to the chancellor shortly thereafter.
Last item, I understand, is a photo from Churchill and FDR?
I believe that's a still that perhaps you guys have.
All right.
The next thing that I want to show, though, relates to FDR's relationship with Churchill, which was Lend-Lease that Richard Norton Smith was speaking of. Churchill wrote a very lengthy letter to Roosevelt in 1940 talking about how Britain would soon be out of cash in order to purchase weapons, which was the requirement of American law at that time. And so FDR, while on a fishing cruise after the election, labored over this letter for several days and came up with the very unique concept of Lend-Lease, which was if your neighbor's house is on fire, you lend him a garden hose with the expectation that that would save your own house. That's how he relayed that idea to the American people. But this next document that I want to show you actually is a letter, or as a document in Russian written by Joseph Stalin, because after Lend-Lease was initiated, FDR reached out to Stalin asking what he needed through Lend-Lease. FDR sent his aide Harry Hopkins to meet directly with Joseph Stalin, and this is the actual note or shopping list, if you will, that Stalin wrote for Hopkins to bring back to FDR. And it reads from 1 to 4, light anti-aircraft guns, aluminum for airplanes, 50 caliber machine guns, and 30 caliber rifles.
Real quick, do you want to add something?
Well, just the analogy, again, FDR's genius for salesmanship, the idea about the metaphor of the fire hose. Now, conservatives who opposed Lend-Lease said, no, it isn't like lending your neighbor a fire hose that you want back after the fire. It's more like lending him chewing gum. After it's been used, you don't really want it back.
As 1940 progressed, concerns about Japan continued to gather. The next secret conversation with congressional leaders is on the concerns over Japan.
And you see, well, hell, now, I'm always totally frank about these things. The Prime Minister of Japan has just given out an interview in which he says that Japan would regard it as an act of war if we were to give aid and comfort to any of the enemies of Japan. Now, what do you mean? What does the word attack mean? I don't know. It's perfectly possible, not the least bit probable. I mean, it's a Jack Garner would say, it's a 1 in 10 shot, that Hitler and Mussolini and Japan might feel that if they could stop American munitions from flowing to England, planes, guns, aircraft guns, ammunition, and so forth, that they could lick England. Now, they might send us an ultimatum. If you continue to send anything to England, we will regard that as an attack on us. I say I'm terribly sorry. We don't want any war with you. We have contracts, and under our neutrality laws, any belligerent has the right to come and buy things in this country and take them away. They thereupon say, well, if after such and such a date you are continuing to ship munitions to England and planes, we will regard you as a belligerent. Oh, now, what have we got to say on that? They have cause to say, and I say I'm terribly sorry. We don't consider ourselves a belligerent. We're not going to declare war on you. If you regard us as a belligerent, we're frightfully sorry for it, because we don't. Now, all we can say to you is that, of course, if you act on that assumption that we're a belligerent, and make any form of attack on us, we're going to defend our own. Not war, we're going to defend our own, and nothing further.
And Richard Norton Smith on December 7th, 1941, a full year and 2 months later, those fears became realized.
That's true. That's an extraordinary recording as a window into FDR, obviously thinking out loud the scenarios that by which the United States might get into war. Remember, the U.S. and Japan had difficulties. I mean, Japanese aggression had been going on throughout the 1930s. And in 1940, Roosevelt had some reprisals which critics likened to sticking pins in the rattlesnake.
Bob Clark, back at the FDR Library in Hyde Park, New York, Roosevelt gave a speech that I think most everyone in our audience has had some reference point with. It's called his Day of Infamy speech, a day of infamy which will live forever. But you've got documents that give us a glimpse into the president's mind as he was crafting this very important communication.
That's right, Susan. He received word of the attack at Pearl Harbor in the afternoon of December 7th. He was actually having lunch with his aide Harry Hopkins in the Oval Office, in the Oval Study in the mansion of the White House itself. He quickly made some important phone calls, arranged some meetings for later in the day with cabinet officials and with the congressional leadership, and then he called his secretary, Grace Tully, into the office and began drafting a speech he intended to present to Congress the next day. And what I have for you here is the very first draft of the Day of Infamy speech. And it really shows Roosevelt's skill at crafting speeches for a large audience. There was some discussion in the administration as to whether or not it should be a very lengthy speech detailing all of the history of Japanese and American relations dating back some many odd years. But Roosevelt knew that what the American people wanted to hear was the resolve of the administration and of their commander-in-chief now. And so he crafted this speech, and as it was originally dictated to his secretary, it reads, "Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in world history." But when Grace gave him that manuscript back later in the day, and as he read through it, it didn't have the right tone that he wanted, and so he very carefully crossed out world history and wrote the word infamy, which is now, of course, one of the most famous phrases in presidential rhetorical history.
Well, we're going to move from that and fast forward to 1943, where the president travels abroad for conferences on the world situation to both Tehran and Cairo.
That's right, back-to-back conferences. In fact, Winston Churchill famously said the only thing worse than fighting a war with Allies was fighting one without. And the Allies sometimes seem to be at war with each other as much as with the Axis, particularly these conferences. Cairo is important because Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek sits down with Roosevelt and Churchill, and they discuss the war in the Pacific, and they talk about unconditional surrender being the terms that will ultimately be offered to Japan. The more important conference follows a week or so later in Tehran, where the big three meet for the first time, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin. And Stalin desperately wants a commitment from his allies for a second front, an invasion by the Western allies into occupied Europe to take some of the heat off of his own forces on the Eastern Front. Hanging over all of this, however, is the decision, fine, we'll commit to a second front. Who's going to lead that invasion? Who's going to be the general in charge of D-Day? And that's what we'll hear.
Before we go to it, how are these two Asian capitals and Middle Eastern capitals so important to world politics today, selected as the sites?
Well, first of all, Stalin laid down all sorts of conditions in terms of where he would be willing to go, and it wasn't very far from the Soviet Union, and it was a measure of how much Roosevelt wanted to meet him. At this point, Roosevelt really is eager to develop a separate relationship with Stalin, quite apart from his relationship with Churchill. And Cairo, of course, being in North Africa, which at that point was a real major theater of the war. So it was a scene of where the action was going on.
Let's listen in as the President reports to the nation on Christmas Eve 1943 about his international meetings.
My friends, I have recently returned from extensive journeyings in the region of the Mediterranean and as far as the borders of Russia. I have conferred with the leaders of Britain and Russia and China on military matters of the present. At Cairo, Prime Minister Churchill and I spent 4 days with the Generalissimo, Chiang Kai-shek. It is the first time that we'd had an opportunity to go over the complex situation in the Far East with him personally. We were able not only to settle upon definite military strategy, but also to discuss certain long-range principles. After the Cairo conference, Mr. Churchill and I went by airplane to Tehran. There we met with Marshal Stalin. I may say that I got along fine with Marshal Stalin. He is a man who combines a tremendous, relentless determination with a stalwart good humor. I believe he is truly representative of the heart and soul of Russia. And I believe that we are going to get along very well with him and the Russian people.
The Russian army will continue its stern offensives on Germany's eastern front. The Allied armies in Africa and Italy will bring relentless pressure on Germany from the south. And now the encirclement will be complete as great American and British forces attack from other points of the compass. The commander selected to lead the combined attack from these other points is General Dwight D. Eisenhower. His performances in Africa, Sicily, and Italy have been brilliant. He knows by practical and successful experience the way to coordinate air, sea, and land power. The United Nations have no intention to enslave the German people, we wish them to have a normal chance to develop in peace as useful and respectable members of the European family. But we most certainly emphasize that word respectable, for we intend to rid them once and for all of Nazism and Prussian militarism and the fantastic and disastrous notion that they constitute the master race. The war is now reaching the stage where we shall have to look forward to large casualty lists, dead, wounded, and missing. War entails just that. There is no easy road to victory, and the end is not yet in sight. I've been back only a week. It is fair that I should tell you my impression. I think I see a tendency in some of our people here to assume a quick ending of the war, to assume that we have already gained the victory. And perhaps as a result of this false reasoning, I think I discern an effort to resume or even encourage an outbreak of partisan thinking and talking. I hope that I am wrong. For surely our first and foremost tasks are all concerned with winning the war and winning a just peace that will last for generations.
That video was part of the collection of the FDR Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York, which you see on your screen right now. And inside the library is FDR's own study, which Mr. Eberhard, he actually used to deliver that fireside chat.
Yes, he actually delivered the speech from this room. It was one of several fireside chats that originated from this room.
You also have some pieces in there that connect and tell us more about the story?
Sure. I mentioned earlier that the study really is the largest artifact, in a sense, in the museum's collection. There are so many stories and so many things associated with all the furnishings in this room. One very large object in the room that relates to the Tehran conference is the rug that I'm standing on. This was a gift to Franklin Roosevelt presented by the Shah of Iran, who was a very young man at the time, to him during the conference. And it was brought back to here to Hyde Park and just happened to fit the room perfectly, so he had it placed here in the room.
I see those curators' white gloves on, so you have a few other things to show us.
Just a couple of things, actually some documents that I wanted to show you that relate again to the Tehran conference. Richard Norton Smith was talking earlier about the decision to appoint Dwight D. Eisenhower to head Overlord, and then we heard Roosevelt speaking about that in that clip. This is a document a few days before that speech where Roosevelt, it's a draft of a message Roosevelt sent to Churchill where he's talking about the timing of the announcement of the appointment of Eisenhower to be the leader of Overlord. He says, replying to your 512 of December 19, I'm agreeable to an announcement on January 1st of selection of Eisenhower to command Overlord. Then he goes on in detail about his subordinates underneath Eisenhower. Of course, as you heard from that clip, he changed his mind, I guess, and decided to make the announcement earlier. Later on in the document, he actually mentions need to discuss several matters about subordinates who would be under Eisenhower with General Marshall. I think it's worth mentioning here that George C. Marshall, General Marshall, was everyone's assumption that it was going to be him who was going to lead Overlord, and the decision to go with Eisenhower was one that had to be handled very delicately by the president, and I think it was. Another document that I want to show you, which is I think fascinating, relating to the Tehran conference, is this very simple document, simple looking, but it's basically a little doodle or sketch, I guess you would call it, that Roosevelt made during the Tehran conference. And I think it speaks to the vision of Franklin Roosevelt, the fact that all during the war he's really thinking about the post-war. And this is where you come face-to-face with it. This is a little doodle done on a scratch of paper, and what he's done up here is he's created 3 circles, and they represent really the basic building blocks of what becomes the United Nations. All during World War II, Roosevelt was a steady advocate for the creation of some sort of organization after the war that would hopefully avoid the recurrence of a world war. He had lived through World War I. He'd seen the failure of the League of Nations during the 1920s and 30s, and he was really very, very committed to finding a way to create a post-war organization that would endure after World War II. So again, coming back to this document, here he's sketched, and this is again during the Tehran conference. The war is far from over. This little block, 40 UN, it's the 40 nations at that point that were part of the United Nations, as he called them, who were fighting against the Axis powers. That, in essence, is the notion of the General Assembly of the United Nations. Then in the center, he has Executive Committee, the notion of a permanent secretariat that would staff the United Nations. And then over here, he's got 4 police, meaning the 4 policemen. This is the notion that there would be certain nations eventually which became part of what we know as the Security Council that would have the power to sort of enforce the peace. Interesting thing, Roosevelt's notion of the 4 policemen was that it was going to be the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and China. That was the 4th nation. And just very quickly, one last item here on the desk I find very interesting is, you can't quite see it perfectly, but there's a stand of four flags that he kept on his desk here. And this was the way it was at the time of his death. And it is the 4 flags of those 4 nations that made up what he felt were going to be the 4 policemen in the post-war period.
That close-up camera work, handheld, no easy feat, is being done by our colleagues Jake Scheuer and Bob Young, and great work from our colleagues up there. Mr. Everhart, I think this is the last we're going to see you for these 2 hours. I want to thank you for all of your help, both tonight and throughout the preparation for this program.
It's been my pleasure.
It is time for us. We have about 15 minutes left in this 2-hour segment on FDR's presidency and on the documents and artifacts of his presidential library in Hyde Park, New York. And it's time for our phone calls with you. Phone numbers are beneath me on the screen right now for our television viewers. And let's take our first phone call for this segment, which is from Kilgore, Texas. Caller, you're on the air.
Yes, hello, thank you. This question is for Mr. Smith, and it's about the Schlesinger poll, which is a wonderful tool for history teachers. And I was just wondering, as most historians age that would, of course, remember FDR or still consider him a great or near great president, and will any of the criteria change, or will it remain the same dealing with the Schlesinger poll about FDR?
Thank you. Explain what the poll is for.
Yeah, Arthur Schlesinger, Jr., who wrote a multi-volume magisterial biography of FDR and his presidency, was, of course, a Harvard professor and conducted a poll of other academics ranking American presidents. And FDR ranked very close to the top, along with Abraham Lincoln and George Washington. In fact, that's the holy trinity of the American presidency. And almost every poll since then, those are the 3 names that keep turning up. In terms of the criteria, yeah, in effect, that's a very good question. It isn't that we're going to discover more facts at this late stage, but the fact is every generation applies its own criteria. And so there is no doubt that, for example, I'll give you 2 very quick, there's 2 books right now. If you want to read, there's a wonderful cradle-to-grave biography of FDR, not uncritical, but it's certainly broadly admiring, by Gene Edward Smith, called FDR. Then an author named Amity Shales has written a new revisionist account of the Great Depression called The Forgotten Man. I would recommend you read both of them and make up your own mind.
High Point, North Carolina. You're on the air.
Yes, I was just curious, how did President Roosevelt travel throughout the world during the war without being sunk by the foreign enemy ships? I was just curious about that.
How did they ensure his own security as he traveled?
Well, he had a flying boat, I believe. Now, maybe, I'm sure the folks at Hyde Park can confirm that. It was a risky operation, and as it was for Churchill. And in fact, both FDR and Churchill were willing to accommodate Stalin, who didn't want to travel. But I believe he traveled by a flying boat for much of this.
Bob Clark, can you tell us more?
Well, sure. Certainly the Secret Service and the military security that traveled with FDR were very concerned about the president's safety. So as you see him traveling to the various international conferences, you tend to see the conferences taking place in areas that had been captured by Allied troops or were domestically easy to reach. So, for example, the Casablanca conference took place after Allied troops had secured Casablanca, and that's the trip that Richard is recalling, where he took a flying boat and he flew first to South America, then across the Atlantic to the western shore of Africa, and then up to Casablanca. There were two conferences in Quebec, Canada, which of course were easy for Roosevelt to travel to by train, and then the Tehran conference and the Cairo conference took place at a time when North Africa had been secured, and then the flying lanes to Tehran were secure as well.
Eric Hansen is our director for C-SPAN in Hyde Park, New York, and Fred Sampaio is at the controls here in Washington, D.C. Next telephone call is from San Francisco.
Yes, I understand that President Roosevelt was a Mason. Can you comment on his Masonic history, and did he receive a Masonic burial?
Mr. Smith.
Oh, God, you would ask. He was a Mason. I don't know how important it was to him, and I don't, frankly, know whether he had a Masonic burial.
Bob Clark, do you have any documents connected to his membership in the Masons?
I don't have any here with me right now, but our holdings do have a few things related to his Masonic membership. It was one of those organizations that his father had been a part of, and he, of course, was proud to be a part of it, too. I unfortunately don't recall what degree Mason he was, and I'm not aware that the burial here in the Rose Garden was a Masonic burial, because the organization for FDR's funeral took place very quickly. He died in Warm Springs on the 12th, and he was buried here in Hyde Park on the 15th.
Poughkeepsie, New York, as we talk about Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Hello, Poughkeepsie.
Yes, hi. I'm aware that Mr. Roosevelt had, I think it was 5 sons, and I was wondering what part did they play in the service during the war, and if any of them were seriously hurt.
Thank you. Mr. Clark, back to you on that.
Sure. FDR actually had 5 children, 4 of whom were sons, and all of them served in the war. One was in the Army Air Corps, 2 were in the Navy, and 1 was in the Marines. And I can tell you that they all served with distinction, and all were decorated soldiers. I believe that Franklin FDR Jr., who served in the Navy in the European theater, was injured when his naval vessel was torpedoed.
And we're seeing some of the sons right now in the film that you're seeing as we watch and listen. Our next call is from Williamsburg, Virginia. Williamsburg, welcome to this conversation.
During the first hour, I was surprised when, and maybe I just got the impression, that the term New Deal came along and it just kind of stuck. But actually, it was one of 3 deals, the first being under Teddy Roosevelt, and President Truman also had a deal. And I believe Teddy Roosevelt's was the fair deal, and that Franklin Roosevelt's was a continuation of that, being the New Deal. Could you comment on that,
Sure.
please?
Well, Mr. Smith, you were the person who explained the New Deal.
Well, TR and FDR, of course, FDR modeled himself in many ways after his cousin. And it was TR who was the first president to name his administration. And it was called the Square Deal, actually. And it's not far-fetched to believe that FDR, who emulated TR in so many other ways, would take to the idea, first of all, of packaging his program and calling it the New Deal, which also reinforced the notion that this was a break. This was a dramatic change from what the people had experienced under the Hoover administration. Harry Truman followed, and he had the fair deal.
We want to welcome back into the conversation the director of the FDR Library and Museum, Cynthia Cook, who joins us from FDR's study at Hyde Park, New York. Dr. Cook, I'm going to have you talk a little bit, just take a moment out as we fast forward through his presidency. In 1944, he was elected to an unprecedented 4th term to office, but he didn't live to see very many days of that term. Can you tell us a little bit about Franklin Roosevelt's death and his last days?
Well, I certainly can. He was, of course, he ran a campaign in which his health had become an issue. However, he began in September to turn that around with a famous speech to the Teamsters in which he refuted some Republicans' charges that he had left his little dog Fala on a destroyer up in the Aleutians. And it was such a funny speech that everybody could see that FDR, the old FDR, was back. He followed that up with an early November tour of 4 of the 5 boroughs of New York City in an open car in the driving rain. Again, the ebullience, the health, the vitality was there. He was reelected, and he was inaugurated, and all of the children, all of the grandchildren, I think there were 13 of them at the time, were invited to that final inauguration, which in itself was a bit of a foreboding. Nonetheless, he began one of the biggest and most arduous journeys of his presidency, traveling to the Middle East, to a meeting at Yalta, again with Stalin and Churchill, and following that up with meetings with 3 of the leaders of Middle Eastern countries at the time, held most famously the one with Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia on Great Bitter Lake, where he was seeking a Palestinian home for the Jews in Palestine. He came back to this country, delivered an address to Congress, which for the first time in his entire presidency and his whole public life, he said to the assembled crowds, and of course the newsreels were there as well, that he was going to, if they didn't mind, he was going to sit down and deliver this speech from a seated position because he'd just come back from a very long journey and he was too tired to stand, carrying 20 pounds of steel on his legs. And so he gave his report on the Yalta Conference and on his view for the future, but he was a very ill man by that time. And,
let me jump in at this point, get a couple calls, and we'll talk about his final day when we come back after these questions. Next up is Thurmont, Maryland. Thurmont, you are on the air.
Boy, this is a super program. Thank you for having it. My question is, was President Roosevelt and Douglas MacArthur related in any way?
I think I saw somewhere there actually is a distant relationship. It really didn't count for much. FDR famously said that Douglas MacArthur was one of the 2 most dangerous men in America, the other being Huey Long.
Barrington, Washington.
Yes, I'm calling on the Republican line. I think that those of us that enjoy a free market, free enterprise system should be thankful to FDR and probably have a little better place in our heart for him, because the CRC camps that he implemented and the NRA and the New Deal program and things that he, social programs that he implemented preserved our economy, I think, and kept us from swinging dangerously far to the left, and ironically preserved the free marketplace that we enjoy today.
A very quick answer on that. You referred earlier to the fact that he employed solutions that involved people working.
Oh, absolutely. FDR, it can be argued, saved capitalism from itself.
Bob Clark, a quick answer for that caller?
Oh, I completely agree. Roosevelt was dismayed by the ire that capitalists had for him because, as Richard says, his intent all along was to save democracy and capitalism and have America be a beacon of democracy for the world.
Beach Haven, Crest, New Jersey. Hello, caller, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Your question?
My question, it's really not a question, it's an answer. An earlier question that was asked in this program is, how did Roosevelt introduce, how did he get the idea about Social Security? The answer is that he introduced Social Security in the state of New York when he was governor. And that's the idea. That's where he got the program.
Cynthia Cook, response for that caller or anything to add?
I think that's true, but of course we have to remember that it was also something that was coming out of his administration. Many of the things that happened during the New Deal were steps that were taken here in New York State when he was governor, and even back to the idea of the fireside chats. He began his radio addresses to the citizens of New York City. I wanted to say something about the phrase New Deal because it came about almost accidentally as the name for his program. He used the phrase New Deal twice in his address at the 1932 Democratic Convention in Chicago, but it was the press who picked up the idea, probably remembering the square deal of Teddy Roosevelt, and gave the name the New Deal to this new campaign, this new presidency, this new idea, and it stuck. But it really wasn't something that was dreamed up quite as intentionally as we might think.
We have 1 minute. I'm going to get a lot in. Brooklyn, very, very, very quick question.
Quick question. The firstborn was Anna, I believe, right? And she had a son, Curtis, was called Buzz. How come his last name was still Roosevelt? when she married Doll?
I'm not
I can
sure.
answer that.
Okay. Go ahead.
Curtis changed his name at a certain point in his life and decided that he wanted to use the Roosevelt name, which was his middle name. So he was born Curtis Roosevelt Dahl, but when he was working with his grandmother in France, people had a hard time with that name Dahl. They saw him as a Roosevelt, and he realized it was just a lot easier and a lot better for him to drop the last name and be Curtis Roosevelt as he is known today.
At this point, we're going to say thank you to Bob Clark because we're just about to our final seconds here. Thank you for all of your help this evening in understanding FDR. And Cynthia Cook, as we come to you, we promised 30 seconds on Roosevelt's last day.
On his last day, well, first we have a few documents here. The headline from the Los Angeles Herald, Roosevelt is dead. You can see the shock, the huge horror of the whole thing, also a photograph of Roosevelt near the end of his life. I also have a draft of what is speech that was never delivered. It was to be delivered on April 13th. This is the first page of the speech, but I would like to leave you with the last lines in Roosevelt's own hand. These are really his parting words to all of us. The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our dreams of our doubts of today. Let us move forward with strong and active faith.
And as we close here, I'd like to thank you, also to the whole staff of the Presidential Library System and the National Archives, the Chief Archivist of the United States for all their enormous help. And Cynthia Cook, thanks for the folks at Hyde Park for all they've done to put this program together.
That's wonderful. Am I allowed to have a few minutes to...
you know, we are already 1 minute over. You can have 20 seconds.
I'll have 20 seconds because I want people to understand. I mean, there's so much, and I hope we could do more, but I want people to understand that presidential libraries are lively, vital places. And when you come to a presidential library, you're coming to a moment in history. And it is so important for people to be able to do that because you will come away with an understanding not only of the presidency, but the different decades in which they lived. Also, we have websites, and we have a very important conference that is sponsored by all of the presidential libraries. And I hope it's going to be covered by C-SPAN. It's on the presidency and the Supreme Court, and will be held November 11th and 12th here in Hyde Park. Thank you.
And we invite all our viewers, if you're out traveling by car and looking for a destination, visiting Hyde Park or any one of the 12 presidential libraries is certainly an enriching stop. Richard Norton Smith, you have about 30 seconds to summarize what people should take away about FDR.
Franklin Roosevelt changed the presidency forever. Franklin Roosevelt changed how we think of government. Franklin Roosevelt changed America's role in the world. Franklin Roosevelt changed his party. He was the greatest agent of change in the 20th century, and he still speaks to us.
And Franklin Roosevelt, given his advancing illness, selecting Harry Truman as his vice president, set the stage for the next presidency when he died shortly after being sworn in for his 4th term, and that will be our topic.
Visits the Franklin Roosevelt Presidential Library in Hyde Park, New York, and explores the career of our 32nd president.
A library built by popular subscription to house the archives, papers, and mementos of the Franklin D. Roosevelt era is dedicated to the nation by the President himself. And this latest addition to the archives of America is dedicated at a moment when government of the people by themselves is being attacked everywhere. It is therefore proof, if any proof is needed, that our confidence in the future of democracy has not diminished in this nation and will not diminish.
As part of the Presidential Library series, C-SPAN Radio will air 3 of FDR's fireside chats. His September 3rd, 1939 address after Germany invaded Poland to start World War II. The December 9th, 1941 address following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. And his report on the progress of the war from February 23rd, 1942. You can also hear remarks by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt on the day of the Pearl Harbor attack, as well as an interview with Pulitzer Prize-winning presidential historian James McGregor Burns. That's tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern on C-SPAN Radio. For more historic footage and other exclusive materials, go online to our special website at cspan.org/presidential